Welcome to the Greener Way podcast, a show about people, planet, and purpose, and how investors and corporate leaders push forward in a complex world. We're joined by Julia Leske, head of ESG Australia New Zealand at ISS ESG. ISS owns both ISS ESG and ISS Media, which is the publisher of FS Sustainability in the Greener Way. So that makes Julia one of my extended colleagues. Welcome to the Greener Way, Julia.
Thank you, Rachel. Great to be here.
Excellent. Well, today, Julia, we're talking about ISS ESG's recent Global Thought Leadership Report, Actionable Insights. There's a really interesting specific section on Australia and New Zealand that you and your colleagues wrote about. So I think we're really interested in sharing some of these insights with our listeners. So, Julia, can we start off? Can you just give us a little bit of background on ISS ESG, the report, and how it should be used?
Yes, sure. At ISS ESG, what we do is we provide data and analytics on ESG, environmental, social, governance topics to institutional investors. We do this across a range of different topics and themes, from ESG ratings through to climate data and information, stewardship offerings, and so on. Once a year, what we do is we get our brightest and smartest heads together to talk about and think about what are main issues and topics that might be coming up for investors in the next 12 months. It doesn't need to be topics that we talk about every day right now. It's really about trying to get out the crystal ball and say, what will be something that will be emerging that we should start alerting our clients and people more generally interested in responsible investment to sharpen their minds on specific topics. Sometimes topics come out that we have talked about the last 12 months because they will just become even more important or more to the point in the next 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes there's also quite interesting new angles that investors might want to start think about. We have a global report where we look into take a more global lens, so really looking into topics that will overarchingly be looked at across the globe for investors in the responsible investment space. We then also take a regional approach where we really think about, because there are some nuances in each of the regions that we work with clients where different topics and themes might come up. And I'm very glad that we maintained one of the regions to be Australia and New Zealand, where we're allowed to really take a bit more of a Australia-New Zealand lens on ESG issues and topics that will be discussed and that we can see as a local team might be of interest in the next 12 months.
With that in mind as sort of the context, Julia, what are the most important insights from Australia and New Zealand?
In Australia and New Zealand, we see that public and private sectors are responding in various ways to challenges of providing adequate insurance and in particular in the face of climate change. We've seen increasing impact of weather events in Australia, also in New Zealand, sadly, earlier this year. And this is a debate that will only keep increasing in our region. Then another big topic on the cards for Australia is definitely the voice to Parliament and how that may permeate through into corporate and investor discussions and regulation as well.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, where we're also seeing at industry level, one of the big challenges but also we see an opportunity in there is aligning our infrastructure with broader sustainability goals.
Okay, so those are three very chunky, very deep topics. I think let's focus on insurance and uninsurable assets and infrastructure first and save the First Nations discussion to the end and for our listeners. So when you're talking about insurance risk and uninsurable assets, Julia, how does that tend to play out specifically in the Australia-New Zealand context? I mean, obviously, we've seen unbelievable natural disasters in both countries. Is it a time now for investors to look at their the portfolio companies and say, look, there's parts of your assets that are no longer insurable?
Yes, I mean, we already have a lot of our investor clients looking into physical risks associated with their investments. And I think that's not a new debate, but it's definitely going to be of greater focus as we're seeing these weather events playing out. And I think there's really two interesting aspects to it. The very first one is understand your assets, understand the physical risks that there might be exposed to, but then also try to understand what it means more broadly for the insurance sector, how we will be structured, how will insurance approach different areas and different spheres, and then also what does it mean for those communities where we may start to see uninsurable or unaffordable insurance. One of the interesting pieces to this debate as well is that traditionally insurance, we're seeing it as a pooled product. We're saying, okay, we're pooling all the different risk categories into one pool, and then everyone is insured against these events. This is
Mm-hmm.
changing. We're seeing quite sophisticated risk modeling being applied to different areas. And I mean, on a private level, it might be a bit easier to understand and associate with it. If you own a house in a flood prone area, your insurance costs will go up based on that specific location analysis. And we've also seen some moves where certain insurance companies have said, we're not going to continue to insure in these areas until governments step in to provide certain protections for those communities or imply certain rules. So there's a quite interesting insurance debate going on in the background. A lot of claims are still up in the air. How do we really protect private and public and company assets from these impacts? We have seen certain operations being impacted already by weather events. So, what does that mean in terms of mine sites needing to pause operations for certain days or weeks to deal with flood events, potential environmental consequences, and who's then responsible for that and picking up the costs for these issues? They're all things that will be considered and will need to be considered.
And then I suppose as well, there's sort of risks around physical risks and how it impacts on communities and how it impacts on the ability of providers to get into those communities themselves. There's another layer to layer on top of it.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's not an easy one to solve, but
No.
it's definitely one that we want to see that we have an active conversation about with investors, and that investors are starting to think through that, because I think just those examples show how quickly it can become quite complex, and it will
Mm.
require a lot of time to analyze and properly understand, engage with companies or with regulators, broader insurance, reinsurance companies, and so on. It's a quite complex issue for investors to address and to understand, or have multiple approaches to address it as well. Because I don't think it's as easy as saying, we're going to step away from these companies. In some cases, it might be the
Hmm.
decision, but in other cases, there needs to be a range of responsible investment tools applied in these cases.
Mm.
And I think we're still at the beginning of understanding where are the risks in a portfolio, and only then you can start
Hmm.
thinking about how do we start to address them.
So now infrastructure, Julia, this seems like a space where things are moving very quickly when it comes to changes in government policy, like rewiring the nation, alignment to net zero outcomes and sustainable outcomes. What were some of the things that stood out to you, both in Australia and in New Zealand, when it comes to the infrastructure sector?
It's a really interesting mixed bag, because I think traditionally we have quite resource intense remote infrastructure projects, where we're also seeing some aging happening, and they at the same time there's the opportunity, as we have new investments, new approaches and new views taken, that we can really renew and replace with a lot of sustainability principles in mind. I think we're definitely seeing a lot of encouragement around the climate piece. There's a lot of pressure now from the government as well as from the industry, as in from the investment industry, to really start looking into our climate impacts when it comes to infrastructure development, and where we put or prefer to put the funds, and where funds should be
Hmm.
flowing to. But then
Hmm.
there's also increasing debates around when we finance infrastructure, what other aspects are important around more social principles and community impacts, and where this will be taken. And I know from conversations again with some of our investor clients that there's increasingly emphasis to focus ESG resources on those infrastructure projects in terms of understanding what is going on there from a ESG perspective, understanding what can be done and what should be done, and how can investors apply a more in-depth analysis to those projects, and then really helping steer them into a more sustainable direction.
And then finally, Julia, as we were sort of talking earlier in the episode, the focus on First Nations people. What are you highlighting there? And given what went into writing this report and the sort of the momentum of the conversation around the vote on the referendum voice to Parliament, how is this playing out as particularly a business and an investor impact?
Yeah, so I mean, the voice of Parliament is really interesting in terms of it's been on the cards for a long time. It's now being taken to a referendum later in the year. It's really come out of the Uluru Statement of the Heart in 2017 within a range of reform proposals to improve the lives of First Nations people in Australia. While the current proposal is that the Voice to Australia will be an advisory and consultative body to be enshrined in the Australian Constitution, the establishment of the Voice really will bring heightened attention for those who are legislating within Australia to consider
Mhm.
impacts on First Nations people. And that will, in
Mhm.
time, permeate through into different types of legislation that will govern corporate and investor responses, implementations of reporting of infrastructure development, as we talked just about it,
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
and different areas where projects and corporate actions impact on First Nations people on the ground. And this will mean that investors, and we, again, as we're talking with our clients, we can already see heightened attention and demand for better understanding. What does
Mm.
it mean within our portfolio? What are the things we should be watching out for? Where are the areas of risk in relation to First Nations people that we should be aware of? This is related to existing allegations and controversies, but also what do we know about commitments that companies have made? Where do they stand? And what are they doing? And this is something that will be increasingly important, and there will be increased attention towards that. And
Mm.
I think we can also see that in the recent recommendations that were given by the Australian um,
ASFI,
ASFI,
yeah, the
Australian
Australian
Sustainable
Sustainable
Finance
Finance
Institute.
Institute.
I'm sorry. Having it is, I wanted to avoid to use the jargon, so apologies about me stumbling there. But so we can certainly see in the taxonomy recommendations, and it's not yet written into any law, any actual industry standard. But we can. I think it's fair enough to assume that there do no significant harm criteria. There is an expectation that investors will start addressing impacts on cultural heritage as a very, very minimum. So this will
Mm.
be, and I think this is sort of one of the first indications, and the voice to Parliament also bring along that expectation in the broader debate, and it's definitely lifting in significance in the broader responsible investment debate, and the way that investors are
Mm.
looking at their portfolios, wanting to understand them, and then we'll also start acting on it. So again, we'll
Mm.
probably see an increase on engagement activities, potentially exclusion or at least risk flagging activities,
Mm.
and then conversations around this topic.
I think that conversation point, just as we're coming to a close here, Julia, I think that's a real sleeper issue. I've been listening to some very interesting conversations by businesses who are thinking about their role as an information broker and a source of education for their employees and their communities, not to influence people's votes, or not even to, I know they're weighing up whether businesses will publicly back the voice, but their role as institutions for their employees to provide sources of information that can assist people to make a decision without, disinformation or sort of overly emotive language on either side. And that role, I think, is something very interesting for companies to explore from that social license to operate. So definitely a watch this space for both of us, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. And I think when we were talking about it before, it's just it might seem at first sort of if you look at it from afar, it's like, well, this is a political issue. This is a
Mm-hmm.
referendum. This is something where people
Mm-hmm.
should be voting on. And of course, it's about their own
Mm-hmm.
personal opinion and decision. But these
Mm-hmm.
debates are increasingly coming into the corporate debate. And we've seen this very strongly in the marriage equality debate and discussions where we've had a
Mm-hmm.
lot of corporates really jumping into this. That 5, 10 years ago, most corporates would have said, no, this is nothing for us to touch or to influence. And I think it will be something that will start to come into this corporate debate. And there will be some corporates that will be looked to, or brands and public
Mm-hmm.
facing business leaders, and they will be asked about, where do you sit in this debate, on this campaign, and what does this mean for your business, and how do you address these issues in your business? So I do believe that this will become a much broader debate where corporate Australia, and through that investing Australia, will be brought into. And we do need to make sure that the information is there, and that there is a way to position yourself somewhere in
Mm-hmm.
this debate.
Agree.
At least it should be a conscious thing. I always say it doesn't really matter where you end up landing, but be sure you're aware of it and it becomes a conscious response and an informed response.
Agreed. Well, Julia Leske, thank you so much for joining us here at The Greener Way.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to the Greener Way podcast. If you liked today's show, remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Any feedback? Contact us on podcast@fssustainability.com.au. I'm Rachel Allen-Backus.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. FS Sustainability operates under an Australian Financial Service License and the exemption made available under the Corporations Act 2001 in respect to any information or advice given. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.